Oh, I have no pocket at all. Okay. Yes, please. So just. Okay, thanks. So right, we'll keep it going forward. Okay, good. I can do that. Hi. Are you introducing? Yes.
So I'm especially honored to announce this next speaker, Joyce Tischler. She's affectionately known as the mother of animal law. She began as a young attorney working in the Bay Area, where I'm also from. No, I'm also from the Bay Area. And just one example of her work that really inspires other animal activists is at one point, 500 wild burros were slated to die as a result of generally weapons testing. So immediately, Joyce Tischler drafted a NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act complaint, and took a plane and gave it to the judge, who ordered a temporary restraint order and saved the lives of those 500 wild burros, which are like little donkeys. She's really a force for change to be reckoned with, and someone who other animal lovers, activists, attorneys are really inspired by. So it's my honor to present Joyce Tischler. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good morning. Is this on? Okay, good. All right. Coming from the left coast, I see some folks I haven't seen in a long time, so I want to just do a shout out to Priscilla Farrell, who has founded and heads one of the major animal rights and wildlife groups in the United States, and has done fabulous work. And hello to Sue Porto. Haven't seen you in years. Yeah, another animal lawyer. There's an old political joke in this country that when you're up to your ass in alligators, it's hard to remember that you went in there to clean out the swamp. So you may be asking yourselves why in a trafficking conference, when we're talking about the slaughter of so many elephants and the possibility and distinct possibility that they may go extinct, why I came here to talk about animal rights. And my answer is twofold. First, we've been in this horrible position before, and we're going to be there again unless we begin to reframe our attitude about elephants. It was not that long ago, in the 1980s, when we had a similar crisis. Elephant populations plummeted by 50% due to slaughter by humans. And then there was a response from CITES, which is described to you in your materials, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, and domestic legislation in the U.S. That was effective in bringing elephant populations back. That's wonderful. But then the parties to CITES came up with the idea of one-off ivory sales, and that stimulated poaching again, and now the situation is dire. At the root of this seesaw treatment of African elephants is that we see elephants as renewable resources. We believe that they are ours to take and to control and to use as we please. We can make them into piano keys, we can make them into combs or trinkets or whatever we want. Driving African elephants to the point of extinction every 30 years is not only devastating to the ecology, it's immoral, it's reprehensible. And it says, to me at least, that as a species, we are nowhere near as smart as we'd like to pretend we are. The second reason I want to talk about elephant rights is that as a lawyer, and I speak to other lawyers and law students here, we learn about power. We learn how to use it. We can learn how to abuse it or not. We learn when we have it and when we don't, and what we do in each of those instances. Animals don't have power. They are property under the law. And when you're property, you have no power. There have been human beings in the United States who have also been property. Africans kidnapped from Africa who were brought here and made into slaves. Women, children, people who are mentally incompetent, Native Americans have all been property in the United States. And over time, they have been released from the property status. One gains power when one is not property. One gains legal rights when one is not property and one becomes a person. For the rest of today, you're going to hear from speakers who are viewing the elephant crisis from the ground. So I'm going to offer a 25,000-foot view and suggest one way to reframe our discussion about elephants. I'm an animal rights lawyer, as has been said. I'm also an animal protection lawyer because there really are no rights for animals yet. I founded ALDF in 1979, and I've worked in this field for 35 years now. And I want to introduce you to the kind of discussions that we have about rights and how this could be applied to elephants. And the arguments I'm making can be applied to other animals, but today we talk elephants. That didn't? Ah, it did. Okay, good. I'm from this generation, and if it happens right, it's a miracle. Yeah. In his groundbreaking legal essay that was written in 1972, USC law professor Christopher Stone wrote, "Throughout legal history, each successive extension of rights to some new entity has been theretofore a bit unthinkable. We are inclined to suppose the rightlessness of rightless things to be a decree of nature, not a legal convention acting in support of some status quo. For 2,000 years, other animals have been categorized as things. It's not hard to see how this happened 2,000 years ago, or 1,000 years ago, or even 500 years ago. Scientists then believed that animals didn't think, that they didn't feel, that they were just a step above plants, right? Early religious scholars, especially in Christianity, were attempting to elevate humankind, and therefore they were trying to distinguish between human beings and what they called the lower beasts. So they developed this border, this wall between humans and other animals. The legal system is a reflection of our society and of these ancient societies wanting to create these clear boundaries. So over here, we've got human beings, and they have legal rights. They're called persons. And on the other side is all of the rest of creation, right? Chimpanzees, elephants, chickens, turtles, whales, hawks, cats, dogs, cattle, the list goes on and on and on. They're all together in there, and they are things, chattel, property, renewable resources. They can be used to satisfy even the most trivial interests of human beings. And their pain, their needs, their interests, their familial ties are ignored. In other words, they're objectified, and it's okay to exploit them. Well, there's been a lot of cultural change in 2,000 years. But we continue to exploit animals, and being the technologically savvy creatures that we are, we have refined the process. How this works with African elephants in the wild is that when they try to occupy the same space as human beings, the elephants are considered pests, and they are killed or driven away. In the U.S. and in other countries, there are zoos. And elephants are very popular exhibits in zoos. Everybody loves elephants. They want to go to the zoo and see the elephants. It's a moneymaker for the zoos, and few people consider the impact that it has on the elephants. I'm teaching animal law at Lewis and Clark Law School this semester, and we went to the zoo. I gave my students an assignment. Each of them had to take a species, or groups of them had to take species, and they had to research what those species' lives are like in the wild, and then they had to research what laws in the U.S. apply to these species, and then we went to the zoo to see their species in the flesh. When we got to the Asian elephant exhibit, the student who had researched elephants in the wild started to cry, because the elephant there, the lone bull Asian elephant there, was exhibiting stereotypic behavior. He was in a pit with basically a bunch of dirt and nothing else. And he was just bobbing his head and walking around in his lonely area with nothing to do, nothing to keep him active or keep his intelligent mind busy. And she apologized for crying. She thought it was unprofessional, but it was perfectly reasonable to cry because she saw the difference up close and personal between what this elephant had at that zoo versus what he would have in the wild. Being in zoos causes a variety of problems for elephants. Zoos cannot possibly provide them with adequate space that they would have if they were in the wild. They keep elephants in unnaturally small groups. They routinely shuffle them back and forth to other zoos with callous disregard for the emotional bonds that those elephants may have developed with elephants they are with. Hours standing on hard surfaces cause foot infections, arthritis, which is the leading cause of death in captive elephants. And people are surprised to learn that zoos are brutal to elephants. They break them. At the Oregon Zoo, which is known as one of the better zoos in the United States, there was a story a few years ago of a 5-year-old elephant named Rose 2 who had 176 gashes and cuts on her skin after having been repeatedly beaten with a bull hook. According to some witnesses at the Dickerson Park Zoo, an elephant named Chai was beaten with bull hooks and pieces of wood for 2.5 hours. Circuses are even worse than zoos, as you can imagine, because they are training elephants to do pretty stupid tricks. They use physically violent methods, including use of bull hooks, axe handles, and baseball bats, to beat elephants and to train them to do these tricks and to walk around the ring. That's a baby elephant being broken. All of this to the amusement of the paying customer and the economic well-being of the circus. But all of this actually pales in comparison to the mass slaughter of wild elephants solely for their ivory, for their tusks. Human beings love ivory. They can carve it into beautiful objects. It's a status symbol. It costs a lot of money and it makes people feel wealthier. It's coveted as a possession. But that's where ivory comes from. That's the hacked off face of an elephant so that we can have ivory. Our vanity caused this. Sorry for traumatizing you. I'll lead you back to something nicer. I finally got to live one of my dreams in December. I went to Kenya and was taken to Amboseli and was able to see African elephants in the wild with their babies, with their families. And I want to try to ask you to move away from viewing elephants solely as a species, solely as members of groups. Look at them as individuals. Particularly in the last 10 years, scientists have documented a great deal about the intellectual and emotional lives of elephants. We now know that they have complex social groupings, that they have large brains, they have central nervous systems that are basically like our own, they communicate, they have a rich emotional life. No reasonable person would suggest that these magnificent beings are things. And our law has to catch up with what science is telling us. If we can begin to see them as they really are rather than how we want to use them, then our treatment of them will change. I realize for some people, thinking of them as individuals, thinking of them as persons is a very radical notion. So I'll try to take a step back now and talk about legal rights. What is a legal right? We don't normally think about why we as humans have legal rights. We just do. We were born with them. We're acculturated to it. There's no generally accepted definition of the term legal right because we just assume. But Roger Galvin, an early animal rights activist, attorney activist, came up with a definition. A legal right is recognized by the law and protected from infringement. The right holder can seek legal protection on his or her own behalf, not someone else on their behalf. The assertion of the right protects the right holder from injury. The relief goes directly to the right holder. And if the right holder cannot defend him or herself directly, if they're incapacitated in some way, a right holder can be represented by a guardian or some other representative. Why do humans have legal rights? Do these descend from the heavens? Legal rights come from us. It's a social contract of a sort, and it's evolving social contract. As I mentioned earlier, human beings have been property, and in the past 150 years in the U.S., the social contract about who gets rights and who gets that level of protection has expanded to include black people, people of color, women, children, gays, lesbians, transgender people, immigrants, Native Americans, people with mental and physical disabilities, and children. Legal rights are established by us to protect our lives, our families, our property, and our values. And they evolve. Let's take an example about the right to life. Each of us consciously values our lives. We have an implied contract that I won't kill you and you won't kill me because we value remaining alive. But what if you breach the contract? What if you kill me? What's going to happen, right? You've crossed the line, and society has set up some rules. It's going to intervene with, at a minimum, a criminal prosecution of you. However, that social contract also says that you're presumed innocent until proven guilty, that you have to be proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, which is a very high standard, that you have the right to counsel, that you have the right to a jury of your peers. We value human life so highly that we set up these social contracts which are then codified into law. But yet we still accept, ipsy dixit, various justifications for why other animals should not have legal rights. So let's take a look at this in the context of elephants. One argument is they don't have our intelligence. They shouldn't have legal rights because they don't have the same level of intelligence or the same kind of intelligence as we do. Well, we've known for some time that elephants are highly intelligent, but it's only in the past decade or so that scientists have focused more rigorously on studying the cognition of elephants. Lewis Irwin of the University of Texas has said that both humans and elephants adapted to life in Africa at about the same time. Both evolved to live long lives and migratory lives. Both experienced a dramatic increase in their brain size. They both live in highly complex social systems and have developed sophisticated systems of communication. In an article published in February of this year in Scientific American titled "The Science is In, Elephants Are Even Smarter Than We Realized," the author, Faris Jabber, presented some of the recent findings: that elephants cooperate with each other to solve problems, that they use tools such as twigs to shoo away flies. Juvenile elephants learn from their elders. They learn everything from their elders. Elder elephants, matriarchs, remember the locations of watering holes, which are essential to keep their families alive, and they show empathy. Empathy is an interesting thing to talk about because that says a lot about the intelligence of the individual. Elephants are often observed refusing to leave sick or injured members of their family, or they struggle to hold up a dying family member. I read a story recently about an elephant who accidentally injured a tribesman, and she refused to leave him. She dragged him over to a tree, put him out of the sun, and stayed there with him. Even though her own family left, she stayed there with him until villagers came to rescue him. In other words, they have a level of empathy that I believe is a sign of extremely high intelligence. But even if you don't accept that, even if you're saying, oh, I doubt you, legal rights in this country don't depend upon how intelligent you are. Less intelligent people don't have fewer rights. They still have full protections of personhood. And while the average intelligence of human beings may be greater than the average intelligence of elephants, there are individual humans, such as severely retarded people or newborn babies, who are less intelligent than the average elephant and function at lower levels. And yet still those human beings are protected as persons under the law. Another reason we hear is that elephants don't have complex social lives. Well, for anybody who knows elephants, I don't have to say another word, but I will. Elephants assist each other in childbirth. The females are born into a family, and they're going to spend their entire lives with that family that's led by a matriarch, and they're going to learn from the family members. I heard a story about a female elephant who was young. It was her first pregnancy. Those last for 22 months, and any of us who've had children can really feel for, oh my God, 22 months pregnancy. But this elephant had gone through the 22 months of pregnancy. It was her first baby. And when the baby was born, she was afraid The baby came out and she looked at it and ran away. And the other female elephants brought her back to the baby and taught her what to do. These female elephants spend their entire lives surrounded by other females. They work together. They care about each other. To say that they don't have complex emotional lives is simply ignorant. A study published in 2013 in Frontiers of Zoology, again, we go back to the scientists and what they can now prove. It's titled Effects of Social Disruption in Elephants Persist in Decades After Culling. And the researchers went to Kenya and actually, they went to two countries in Africa, and they studied two distinct populations. First, they went to Amboseli, and they studied a group of elephants that had not been involved in a cull and had lived in traditional matriarchal elephant society. The other group of elephants they studied had been orphaned as infants or as small elephants in culls that had occurred in the 1980s and 90s. These elephants had been relocated to South Africa. And the study concluded that the relocated orphaned elephants displayed classic signs of long-term psychological damage, similar to PTSD. While the traditional elephant family in Amboseli responded to stimuli in traditional, coordinated ways, the social skills of the orphaned elephants were damaged, even though the culling had happened in some cases 30 years earlier. And the researchers concluded that extremely disruptive events, including culling, and I'm quoting here, poaching, and translocation to new areas or capture for captivity can ultimately lead to serious disruption of the intricate social networks that underpin social structure in these species. Basically, they said these elephants were psychologically damaged. I also recently read a story, and there are many, many stories about elephants, many anecdotal stories, but this was about an elephant in the circus who was being taught a new trick, and she wasn't getting it. And it was going on, and finally, she ran from where the trainers were, flopped down, and started to weep uncontrollably. There are many similar stories of elephants weeping. I suppose if I were a cold behavioral scientist, I'd say, well, maybe someone had cut an onion and her eyes were just tearing up. No, I think we know better. Elephants weep because they're extremely emotional. Another reason that's given, I love this picture. I had the best time on Creative Commons. I just spent hours. I used to like to color. Now I do PowerPoints and I have a blast. So another argument that's given for why we have rights and elephants do not is they do not look like us. I agree. They do not look like us. They are so much better looking than we are. But let's not hold that against them. How close to the human form do you have to be in order to have rights? Did thalidomide babies, some of you are old enough to remember thalidomide babies, which was a horrible thing. Did they have rights? Of course they did. If you're missing an arm or a leg, do you have fewer rights because you don't have as many body parts? Of course not. Physical form does not determine the threshold question of legal rights. Another reason, and there's endless reasons, and I'm sure some of you are sitting there thinking, oh, well, I have another reason, and I'll be happy to entertain questions after, but I will ask you, why are you coming up with reasons? We're told that elephants have no ability to communicate. Well, we've known for some time that elephants communicate with each other through a combination of chirps and low-frequency rumbles, many of which we can't hear, trumpets, as well as nudges and kicks and visual signs like flapping their ears. Joyce Poole, a leading elephant expert, reports that when elephants are getting ready to do a group charge, they look at each other as if to say, are we all ready? Are we all together on this? And then, when they do the charge and they succeed, they have an enormous celebration. They trumpet, they rumble, they lift their heads high, they clank their tusks together, and they intertwine their tusks. The February 2014 issue of PLOS ONE contains an article going back to the scientist and study, and it's called African Elephant Alarm Calls Distinguish Between Threats from Humans and Bees. Okay? In this study, which was conducted on wild elephants in Kenya, researchers recorded and analyzed how wild elephants responded to humans and to bees. They reported that when the elephants were exposed to the voices of local adult male tribesmen, which would signal danger, they produced vocalizations that were acoustically distinct from the vocalizations they produced when they were hearing the sound of bees. In other words, they were communicating with each other not only the fact that there was danger, but identifying the type of danger, bees versus humans. Elephants don't possess immortal souls. Oh, that's a tough one. The possession of souls by animals has been the subject of heated debate amongst the world's religions. Mainstream Christianity tells us that animals do not possess souls. Well, other religions, such as Hindus and Jains, believe they do possess souls. I believe I have a soul, but I can't prove it to you. I can't show it to you on any anatomy chart. I don't know where it is. I believe you all have souls, but I can't prove that either. So why would I assume that these large-brained, highly emotional, highly complex, highly intelligent beings don't have souls? You see a picture there of a 5-month-old infant whose mother has died, and the people from the David Sheldrick Trust went to rescue this infant, and it took hours and hours because the infant was clinging to his mother and wouldn't leave her and kept charging them to keep them away from her. We know that elephants grieve the loss of their family members and that they go through rather significant ceremonies to grieve and to bury the dead. Back to the issue of do they possess souls? If we assume, for the sake of argument, that they do not possess souls, what does this have to do with the law? In this country, with its foundational approach to separation of church and state, the question of possession of soul should be deemed irrelevant to determining legal rights. You can't have rights without responsibilities, a lot of people who are anti-animal rights tell me. Well, in the wild, elephants are highly responsible. They assume full responsibility for every aspect of their lives. They protect their families, they travel great distances, they mate, they find food. That they are captive in the U.S., where they are strangers in a strange land, is no fault of theirs, and the sooner we end that, the better. And besides that, there are certain humans, babies, small children, people with severe physical or mental disabilities, who cannot take on full responsibility for themselves, and yet they have legal rights. Here's another tough one. Richard Posner, who is a distinguished judge, Seventh Circuit, is a firm believer in animal welfare, but he absolutely opposes extending rights to animals. And I won't read, you can read the quote there, but he's argued and debated this on numerous occasions. And he argues that animals cannot have legal rights based on his intuition that being human is what gives us moral rights and that non-humans cannot have that. And I think for a lot of people that's really at the heart of it. I'm human, you're not. I have rights, you don't. I just don't find that statement convincing because my intuition is otherwise. So if it's my intuition versus Richard Posner's intuition, who wins? I do want to mention that law professors such as Alan Dershowitz, Lawrence Tribe, Cass Sunstein share my intuition. They support extending personhood to animals. The need. The simple fact is we don't need to use elephants. They're not essential to our survival. They're not essential to our well-being. We don't eat them. We don't wear them. We don't use them in medical research, which are the most common reasons that I'm often given for the continued exploitation of animals. We don't need them. We prefer to use them. Most zoos continue to exhibit elephants despite the growing evidence that the elephants' needs are being completely ignored. In 2005, the Detroit Zoo became the first American zoo to close its elephant exhibit and to transfer the elephants to a sanctuary based on ethical grounds. They concluded that the elephants' physical and mental health was being compromised. The debate is growing with zoos. Not as fast enough from my perspective, but it is heating up. And a growing number of circuses, such as Cirque du Soleil, are very popular and financially successful without using animals at all. With the wonderful technology we have with IMAX and computers and Netflix and all of this, we can watch documentaries about elephants in the wild that will educate us, educate our children, hopefully embolden conservation efforts. And that's what we ought to be moving to. And as I mentioned, some of you may have other reasons for why animals can't have rights. I realize I'm throwing new ideas at you, but I want to summarize by saying if we examine the reasons that are generally given, what I've given here, they don't stand up, they don't survive analysis. Right holders are really only flexing their muscles and saying, I want to keep it that way because it's convenient and I like it that way. All of these same reasons have been given in previous times for keeping human beings as slaves or keeping human beings as property. We need the slaves to grow the cotton. We need women to stay at home and raise the children. We need children to work the farms. Well, those reasons ended up not being strong, and in time, each of those groups was removed from the property status. We deny elephants legal rights because we want to continue exploiting them. Might makes right, and this is ethically and morally bankrupt. As I said at the start, the fact that African elephants are heading toward extinction is a result of this antiquated mindset and attitude. And so we need to start with the smallest amount of space, that between our ears. Legal rights stem from the necessity to protect interests and to resolve conflicts of interest. But not all interests carry equal weight. It's the role of our lawmakers to decide which interests deserve protection as legal rights and to strike a balance amongst competing interests. Based on the current science, we know that elephants, without a shadow of a doubt, possess interests. To quote the famous American legal scholar Roscoe Pound, who said, we must begin then with the proposition that the law does not create these interests, it finds them pressing for recognition and security. A fair and just legal system has to take into account competing interests of other animals and balance those interests against the interests of humans. Now, I'm not saying that elephants are in every way like human beings. They don't have to be. They're not humans in baggy suits. They are like us in ways that are morally and legally relevant to the issue of rights. And the concept of equality under the law doesn't mean that we are all equal. No, we're not all equal. We're physically different, emotionally different, intellectually different. What we have is the right to equal consideration of our interests. What would this look like domestically? Well, earlier this year, some of you may have read about lawsuits that were filed in the United States to try to get chimpanzees out of captivity in New York State on the basis of habeas corpus. These lawsuits are being spearheaded, they're being spearheaded by the Non-Human Rights Project. And basically what NHRP is pushing is that animals are persons and we need to begin to treat them as such. Within the next 2 years, this same group, NHRP, is going to bring lawsuits aimed at creating personhood status for elephants who are held captive in the United States. So keep your ears perked. Whether these lawsuits win or lose, they are breaking new legal ground and new ground socially in our country. They are altering the discussion about how we view and treat these animals. If NHRP wins these lawsuits, our society is going to be faced with questions about how we treat these animals and where they're going to be. If elephants are persons, what rights should they have? Well, how about the right to life? the right not to be killed without due process for the same kinds of cause that apply to human beings, or the right to autonomy. Obviously, elephants don't belong in the U.S. They're not native to this country, and they are wild animals. They are wild animals who belong in their native country. They can't roam free here. We can't send them back to Africa because they probably couldn't survive at this point. They haven't received the training and the upbringing from the matriarchal society that they would have had they been here. But they should have the right to be elephants to the extent that we can make it possible with the captive elephants who are currently here. They should have the right to exhibit normal elephant behaviors, not be chained all the time, to be independent of institutions and individuals who exploit and brutalize them. And at this point, probably the only answer would be sending them to sanctuaries, allowing them to live out the remainder of their lives, and not bringing other elephants into the country. The right to bodily integrity. Cute as he is, that body should belong to that elephant and not be used to benefit others. The right to a habitat sufficient to support them. As I said, it may be that captive elephants cannot be returned to the wild, to their countries of origin, but they should be removed from the zoos and the circuses, and they should be given habitats that, as closely as possible, approximate their natural habitat, appropriate social groupings which allow them to form and maintain social bonds over the course of their lives. All capture of live animals and import into the U.S. should cease. All sale and possession of ivory should be banned. Sale and possession. I'm going further than a lot. They should have the right to be represented in a court of law, both civilly and criminally, in order to protect against violations of their rights. Get ready, Sue. Okay. What would this look like internationally? Well, on the international level, the only treaty in existence that protects animals is CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. It's a conservation treaty. They don't talk about rights. They don't even talk about standards of welfare. And when I've been to CITES conferences, out of respect for the institution, we don't bring those issues up. I think that should change. I think CITES cannot be the solution because it's also the cause of the growing rate of extinction of elephants. When humans decide that the crisis needs to be responded to, great. But what about when they think, well, we can have sustainable trade in ivory? Well, then we go back to that seesaw. We need to begin to look at elephants differently and stop asking the question, what is sustainable use of them? No use ought to be sustainable. 20 years ago, Professor David Favor of Michigan State developed a welfare treaty for wildlife in other countries, as well as companion animals in other countries. It didn't go very far, but it's now being introduced. And I would suggest that as a first step, that welfare and protection treaty should be thought of as something that we work on. If we were to establish rights, and this is way in the distance, something along the lines of the Geneva Conventions. The Geneva Conventions mainly deal with protection of victims, human victims, in international and non-international armed conflicts. They say that people should be treated humanely without adverse distinction on the basis of race, color, religion, faith, sex, birth, wealth, so on and so forth. And if something like this were developed for elephants, I think that would be fabulous. I would want to develop something else along the lines of the International Bill of Human Rights, the International Bill of Wildlife Rights, the International Bill of Elephant Rights. So, having said that, now that you think I'm ready to be committed, I suppose, I just want to say that those of us who argue for legal rights for animals say that the differences are not legally or morally relevant. In all legally relevant ways, elephants possess qualities that compel us to put aside convention and convenience and to realize that for too long we have ignored and violated their rights. Elephants are not things. Legal systems which treat them as such are very flawed. What are we going to do to fix this flaw? Are we going to wait another 2,000 years till they're gone, till we're gone? Are we going to wait for society to progress? Or are we going to begin now to talk about and change the way we look at them? Those of us who are at the heart of the animal rights movement envision a world in which the lives and interests of all sentient beings are respected within the legal system, where elephants and other wild animals can live out their natural lives according to their instincts as well as their intelligence, in an environment that supports their needs, in a world in which animals are not exploited, terrorized, tortured, or controlled to serve our purposes. I hope that you can, as you think about the crisis and hear the speakers today, consider what needs to be done and consider sharing the vision I'm presenting to work toward a far more just and compassionate world. And thank you. Time for questions?
Fun. Okay, thank you very much for your talk. I'm Jessica Bell from Michigan State University.
Hello.
So I have a couple questions. First, I was wondering if you were familiar with the book Zoopolis, Political Theory of Animal Rights.
I'm sorry?
Zoopolis. It's a book, Political Theory of Animal Rights, and she uses theories based in disability, theorizing to argue for rights for animals, which I was wondering if you thought that could apply to elephants. And my other question is, I've worked with Dr. Gabe Bradshaw on some work on elephant PTSD, and I was wondering if you thought the evidence that elephants do exhibit PTSD based on culling or captive condition, if that's a further argument for elephant personhood.
Yeah, and I think that's something that I talked about, that study that recently came out that showed that even 30 years later, they were exhibiting something akin, I said akin to PTSD, but you're calling it PTSD, and I'm fine with that. Okay. Yeah. In terms of how we talk about rights, I started with Singer's book, as I think most people did, but I'm not a utilitarian. I don't go as far as Singer does because what utilitarianism leads Singer to then say that people with disabilities are less important, and I don't wish to go there. I don't want to downgrade human beings at all. I simply wish to upgrade.
Right. So with Zoopolis, she argues that kind of assisted agency, meaning people who are close to, for example, someone with disabilities can help them communicate their rights and be an active member of society. And so I think with elephants, people who are aware of their intelligence and, for example, scientists could be used to advocate for their rights because they can help elephants express their agency in human society.
Yeah, it can go both ways. I mean, people like me are often accused of being anthropomorphic, and I try to avoid that by saying, by basing my talk on the cognitive research that is happening now. Sometimes scientists get into this bind where they're trying so hard not to be anthropomorphic that they'll see something and they don't want to attribute it to a human-like quality. But, when you see an elephant flopping down and crying, what are you going to say? Why is that elephant doing that? I presume that elephant's doing it for the same reason I would, although I don't flop down and cry too often. Frustration, anger, angst. I can only assume that. Why else would they do that? So sometimes I think scientists, bind themselves too much. And I've read or I've talked to scientists who've said, well, I saw something in the field, but I can't talk about it as being an emotion because no one will respect me. When Jane Goodall first started naming chimpanzees, there was quite an uproar. How can you name a chimpanzee? Call that chimpanzee, Z72. Well, even if she called the chimpanzee Z72, she'd probably still get excited that Z72 was using tools. So it's a tough one. I've developed as a person over time. I hope we all have. And I used to try to not display emotion and try to just stick as much with the facts as I could, particularly being short and female and a lawyer. And I've moved away from that. Yeah. And I've moved away from that. I've gotten back in touch with my emotions. Emotions are good things. Stay in touch with them. Some of the worst things we do as human beings are when we objectify others and are not in touch with our emotional response to what's happening to them.
I think I'm over here. Hi, I'm Jennifer Brown from Quinnipiac, and thank you for your talk, and more importantly for your work, which is really important and inspiring. And I just want to start by kind of locating my own potential bias. Just have to out myself as a person who identifies as a Christian. And so a couple of times during your talk, you referred to Christianity in specific ways, and I wondered if you could say more about that. As distinct from other Abrahamic traditions, or
no, Judeo-Christianity.
Also, we're talking about China, which I think has a large role currently in this, and so just wonder if you could say more, if there's something specific about Christianity that's.
Yeah, sorry, I should have added Jews. Western philosophy, Judeo-Christian ethic, going back to when, and I'm forgetting the name of the philosopher, jeepers, there was a strong desire, Catholicism really played into this as well, to separate humans from animals as a way to lift up humans and cause us to want to protect humans to a greater extent than we had. Why it was done that way, I don't know, but that was the break that was made at that time, and it's persisted, even though today the reasons for it scientifically don't exist as much. Other religions have been more open to acknowledging the souls of being other beings other than human beings, including, some religions see plants and rocks as having souls. And I wouldn't bring that up other than how often I'm told that, well, in the Bible, it says that humans have dominion over others. What does that mean? What does it mean to have dominion? In fact, Matthew Scully's book was called Dominion. Does it mean domination, or does it mean shepherding? So we often have to respond to passages in the Bible which we're told tell us that God made it so that humans dominate other animals. And so to have to respond to that, for me, is somewhat frustrating, because as a lawyer, I separate church and state, and but still have to respond to that. And I see that all the time in decisions. Judges saying, well, I'm not biased, and I'm just following the law, and then they start quoting the Bible, which is somewhat galling.
Thank you. Oh.
No. Yeah.
Okay. You began your talk with the idea of empathy. Mm-hmm. And the book I quoted in my talk by Anne Farrow examines slavery in America, and she has coined a term called empathic failure to describe our failure over to rise above
years.
Yes. Yeah. And she also examined some of the reasons for it, and it is a lot based in Christianity and the belief that these were not, these were heathens, these were savages,
inferior beings.
Yeah. So when you give us the list of things that you'd like us to achieve as a culture, to change this, situation, could you help us understand why you think there has been empathic failure when it comes to these animals? Because that really goes to the, if you're going to get somewhere, if you're really going to change something, you got to know what's causing it.
Right.
I know you gave the list and it all makes sense, but this whole business of empathy, human empathy, where has it gone?
Right.
Why don't we have it? That's my question.
Yeah.
If you've thought about that.
Not
be answerable.
Yeah. Actually, before I get to that, I want to bring up another point, because it's always a little bit dicey to talk about slavery, and I don't want people to think that I am comparing black people to animals, because that's done too often in our still very racist society. What I'm comparing is one social movement to another. What I'm comparing is the lack of empathy that has existed over time for humans. With animals, think about when you get up in the morning, what do? You make your breakfast, which is bacon and eggs. You then go to the bathroom and brush your teeth with toothpaste that probably was tested on animals. And then you get dressed and you put on your leather belt and your leather shoes. We use animals throughout each and every hour of every day. The products that we put on lipstick are often tested on animals. Medical research is done on animals. Animals are in zoos, and we bring our children there. When I brought my students, I told you about the student who was crying at the Asian elephant exhibit. We could hear a mother just a few feet away saying to her child, "Oh, look, the elephant's dancing." We use animals in every part of our existence. We in ways that we don't even know. If you're eating Jell-O, there's gelatin in there, which comes from horses. To change our diet, to change the food we eat, to change the clothes we wear, to change so much about ourselves would take a lot, and people are not willing to do that. And so they're not willing to think about it. We don't want to think about where that bacon came from. We don't want to think about the torture that those chickens are going through who lay those eggs, and now I'm getting into my farm animal thing. Don't get me started. But it runs so deep that... Oh, good. Let's talk. But our use of animals is endemic to our society, and so thinking about them in the ways that I'm talking about is very dangerous.
I think I have it next. Does this work?
Hi, yes.
Yeah, hi.
I
I'm
hear
Ruth
you.
Baker, an animal welfare scientist at Wesleyan University. And the one thing I just wanted to comment on, and thank you for your talk, is this, what I think is very misleading and dangerous, actually, to define an animal's worth based on a definition of consciousness or cognitive skill or awareness, because those definitions shift all the time.
Yes.
And they then leave out a whole group of animals. And so if we talk about, we still should talk about the emotional, the complexity, and the emotional lives of animals, but we shouldn't stop there and think that that's what just defines their worth and their importance, and therefore potentially their right to rights. And even what defines, using tool use and how that's changed, and we sort of change that bar all the time to sort of describe what it means to be closer to humans, essentially.
Right.
And it leaves out more and more animals as we do that. And so I think we need to rethink how we approach what is an animal's worth, their intrinsic value, and not base it on something that I think is hard to define and constantly changing.
Thank you. I'm glad you brought that up. That's a tough one. If I were an abolitionist in the year 1750 and I suggested that a black man could be president, I might not get as far as I would get by suggesting that that black man feels pain and pleasure and is like white men. And in 1750, I probably wouldn't have had the ability to give this kind of talk. But I'd be arguing something that my audience could understand. And I know where you're going, and I agree with you. But the reality is we're setting the foundation. The kinds of things I'm talking about are not going to happen in my lifetime. I'm not going to see these happen. Social movements take so long that as we evolve, you're concerned about if I'm trying to convince an audience that elephants are like us, well, what does that do for dogs? Does it eliminate that idea about dogs or pigs or some other animals who may not have the level of similarity that elephants do? And my response is we've got to start somewhere. And we start with the animals who seem most like us because we're trying to convince an audience of people who haven't thought about this before that they ought to be thinking about this. Eventually, somewhere down the line, hopefully, if we can get the foot in the door with elephants, chimpanzees, cetaceans, then maybe we move on to dogs, cats, pigs, cows, and others. So I agree with what you're saying, and I see the inherent problem with what I'm doing, but I also think that it's a necessary thing to do as a first step.
I've got a question, Joyce. I want to echo the praise for the thought-provoking and articulate presentation. And I have a question about your thoughts on an initiative that I think is very successful in Africa right now, which violates at least a couple of your propositions, that is bodily integrity and autonomy. And this is the initiative to saw off rhino horns. as a way to remove them from the poacher's vision, right? And it does have some consequences, and I don't know enough biology to know whether it would work with elephants. It has social consequences, so it changes the hierarchical order because the rhinos with the big horns now are no longer alpha males. They're, beta at best. But the game reserves that have sawed off the rhino horns and they've stored them somewhere in vaults, they don't want to sell it, but it's worth tons of money. They have suffered no poaching, none whatsoever. So it's clearly very successful. It clearly is saving a lot of rhinos. But on the other hand, it violates most of your propositions.
Right, yeah. These are horrible choices to have to make. With rhinos, at least, there's the possibility of maintaining the animal's life by negatively impacting the quality of that life. If I had to choose, I'd keep the rhinos alive. Elephants don't have that option. You can't saw off their tusks. That's not possible. You have to leave the elephants alive and intact. We make these kinds of choices all the time. We do it in the United States. We've got an overpopulation of dogs and cats. We're killing 4 million a year. Do we spay and neuter them? Is that, violating their bodily integrity? Yes, but the alternative is that we kill them at pounds and shelters. So we make those kinds of decisions all the time. It's sad that we have to make those kinds of choices.
Hi.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Hello. Sorry for my English. I'm a federal judge in Brazil. I'm a doctoral student at Pace University. In Brazil, our constitution prohibits the animal cruelty. In 10 states, the use of elephants in circus is not allowed, is prohibited. And anyone who can vote is able to have standing to protect an animal for a judge.
Yes.
Prosecutors, they have standings, and NGOs, they have standing too. So my question is, do you really think it is a different for animals to have standing, or they just need to have rights? Because in Brazil, the animals have rights, and I don't see why they should have standing. I think it can be a problem for them. Because you will restrict, probably you will end restricting the persons who are able to protect them. Just that question.
Yeah, standing, bane of my existence. I don't know Brazilian law, so I'm at a disadvantage. In the U.S., I can tell you that every lawsuit we have taken in 35 years we've had to deal with the issue of whether or not we have standing to represent the interests of animals. And normally we're not representing the interests of the animals. We are taking some roundabout approach, like using National Environmental Policy Act to say that some environmental impact statement has to be written. We're doing curlicues in the law to come up with ways to protect the interests of animals because we don't directly have standing to represent their interest. If animals were persons, they would have standing. But what you're saying is they can have legal rights without being persons. And there are some theorists who agree with you. Cass Sunstein has said that you don't necessarily need to be persons in order to have legal rights. In the U.S., the way our standing system is set up, the way standing is set up, is so limited. It keeps plaintiffs out of the courtroom rather than allowing them in. And I don't want to spend too much time on that, but it's been a way to keep unpopular plaintiffs out of the courtroom and a way to keep courts from getting flooded with all sorts of suits. I would love to see standing broadened in the U.S. I think that if groups such as mine or some of the other groups represented here had the standing to represent the interests of animals, we could go a long way to doing things that we're not able to do now. And a good example of that is with farmed animals. There are no laws, federal or state, which protect farmed animals while they are in those factories that they're being raised in. And in order to get standing, well, we don't have standing. We simply don't have standing to represent the interests of those animals. And that is, we're talking about 10 billion animals a year who are often in horrible circumstances, not often, generally in close confinement, their basic needs are being completely ignored. They live horrible lives, and nobody has standing to represent those animals. So for us, it's a little hard for me to take off the blinders about standing, because it has been such a nightmare for us here in the U.S. In countries that have less onerous standing provisions, it's been interesting to see how groups, environmental groups and animal protection groups, have been able to do some good things at times. But personhood, standing, all of it is up in the air at this point. I mean, we're at this very early stage with what we're arguing, and it's hard to know where we're going to hit the jackpot and when. You don't know it till it happens. And so you have to, I hate to use the analogy, but you throw everything up on the wall and see what sticks. And then you look brilliant afterwards if you hit the right thing, and you look stupid if you didn't. Any more?
So my question...
Is it time to go?
No. I have a question.
Oh, you have a question?
Yes, I have a question.
Okay.
I don't know if this is on, but I'm on. So this is related to standing, the ability to come into court and stand up for animals. I'm interning at the Attorney General's office, and when we bring animal enforcement case, animal neglect cases, it's an in rem proceeding, a property proceeding. Mm-hmm. So the whole thing is framed from the outset as these are not horses, they are property. It's an in rem proceeding. So I was wondering if you had any other ideas about how these claims could be brought to court in a manner in which, animals are honored in the way that you're saying. Because I'm not, I don't know, family court. I don't know if that would work. I don't know.
North Carolina, of all places, has an interesting law which enables anyone, standing as broad, anyone to civilly enjoin cruelty. Okay, it's highly unusual in the U.S. Normally, with cruelty cases, a prosecutor has complete discretion as to whether or not to prosecute a cruelty case. And if they choose not to, that's it. That's the end of the story. But in North Carolina, if a group such as mine sees cruelty happening, we can file a civil lawsuit and ask a judge for a preliminary and then a permanent injunction to stop the cruelty. And even more than that, this law allows us to actually get possession of the animals. And we did that for the first time in 2005 in a hoarding situation. That's where someone has so many animals that they're not properly cared for, and they may go many months or years without veterinary care and have all kinds of diseases and so on and so forth. It involves a great deal of cruelty. And in this case, we went after a couple who had 500 dogs, and in all kinds of horrible condition. And we were able to convince the court that A, cruelty was occurring, B, that to issue a preliminary and a permanent injunction, and C, to give all the dogs to us, which got a little expensive and hairy. As you can imagine, we had to open a shelter from 3,000 miles away. Right, yeah. Be careful what you ask for. But we were thrilled, and we fought that case all the way up to the highest court in North Carolina and won. And so now we've been back to North Carolina several times, as have other groups, and we've rescued horses and dogs, and we even got a bear out and got him to a sanctuary. So that's a model that I'm happy to share with you that I'd love to see. I don't know how it would work on, federally, but I'd love to see that model introduced in other states, because it would give groups such as ours the ability to get in there and bring relief directly to the animals, which is what we want to do. We want to get them out of harm's way and get them relief rather than just treating them as property.
So like a civil cruelty proceeding.
Yeah, it's effectively that. Yeah. Yeah. And I thought I saw another... this person here, and then...
Hi, sorry, are we out of time? My name is Emily. I'm actually a first-year law student at Quinnipiac. I just wanted, in the spirit of changing dialogue and with Judge Posner's quote, my background is in biomedical and science research, and I actually worked for a department that protected human subjects in research. And one of the first things that physicians and scientists ask is, show me the animal models. Yes. Because if it's safe for an animal, then it's safe for a human being. And so it's sort of, how do you how do you change that dialogue?
Yeah, okay, that's depressing. You don't. You create technology to replace the animals. I mean, that's a very simple answer. But we spent many years trying to get better conditions for animals in research laboratories by suing the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And we lost repeatedly. And we didn't lose because we're bad lawyers. And I'm not putting sour grapes on this. We lost because our society is not ready to even create better conditions for the animals in laboratories, to take primates out of isolation, to give dogs exercise, to give anything to mice or rats, who are now completely excluded from the Animal Welfare Act, which is the only federal law that covers use of animals in research. 95% of the animals simply it doesn't apply to. Our society, in my mind, is rather religious. I'm sorry if about medical research. Those researchers are going to cure cancer. They're going to save our lives. And so we put those blinders on once again. I mean, we're somewhat schizophrenic when it comes to animals. We love them, but we love that dog who's in our home and in our bed. But if that dog happens to be in a research lab, that very same dog has absolutely no rights, and anything can be done to that dog because it's for the betterment of humanity. I'm not going to change the way human beings view that. I haven't in 35 years. What's going to change is that we are developing technology, cell cultures, tissue cultures, mathematical models, computer models that will ultimately begin to replace the animals. That happened, it started, that sea change started around 2008 when the National Research Council issued a report called Toxicity Testing in the 21st Century, where a group of toxicologists on an NRC committee realized that using animals was not working. It was too expensive, it takes too long, and the results are questionable at times. And so this committee of scientists, not animal welfarists, said we need to develop new technologies which are faster, cheaper, and more predictive of how human beings will respond to chemicals and other materials. And so there's a worldwide effort now to develop those non-animals, those in vitro alternatives. My hope is that that's going to bleed over into other areas of research, because that's the only hope I have. I'm sorry, that was a depressing way to end. Can I actually give you a quote, one of my faves, from a Christian, a Unitarian Universalist minister named Theodore Parker was also an abolitionist, and he died in 1860 before slavery ended. But he was giving a speech at the hall of the State House in Massachusetts, the Anti-Slavery Convention in 1858. And this is a quote you've heard, but you've attributed it to Martin Luther King or Abraham Lincoln, but it was actually Theodore Parker who said it. He said, "I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is long. My eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience. And from what I see, I am sure it bends toward justice." Let's hope it does. Thank you.